Alexander. Please, it's only your name I can say. The voice cracks through the midnight silence, dragging him back to a past he thought he buried. 5 years, one accident, and a secret she carried alone. What she's about to reveal will destroy everything he thought he knew and force him to face a love he never deserved. Stay, because this story isn't over until the truth hits. Welcome back to Heartwoven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing wonderfully today. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Make sure you watch till the very end, because this story is full of suspense, twists, and emotions you won't want to miss. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heart-stirring tales. Now, let's dive in. The mansion was shrouded in silence, every corner heavy with shadows, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Alexander Voss sat alone in his study, the faint tick of a clock, the only sound breaking the stillness. He had always ruled his world with precision, a predator in control, untouchable, unstoppable. But that night, at exactly 12:03 a.m., the vibration of his phone sliced through the calm like a blade. The rhythm was erratic, insistent, demanding attention in a way that made his chest tighten. He stared at the screen, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face, a rarity that made the men stationed outside the room shift uneasily. The voice that came through was tense, professional, yet undercut with an urgency that made Alexander's hands tremble ever so slightly. "Sir, there's a patient." "She keeps calling your name," the nurse said, her words catching in the sterile midnight air. Then she repeated it, slower this time, like she could hardly believe what she was saying. "Alexander, Alexander." The repetition carried a weight that felt impossibly personal, almost intimate, and Alexander's gaze hardened, flickering toward the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His men watched, their trained eyes noting every micro-expression, knowing something had pierced their boss's steel. But Alexander didn't ask who the woman was. He didn't need to. The name alone was enough. Emilia Hart. The woman who had once shattered his life and somehow lingered in its shadows, untouched by time, untouched by distance. Memories rushed in, unbidden, jagged, and relentless. He saw her face as it had been the night he had walked away. Pride and suspicion warring in his chest. He remembered the way her eyes had searched his, desperate and broken, how she had called for him and he had left, thinking he was protecting himself from betrayal. Every step toward the hospital felt like stepping into a past he had meticulously buried beneath walls of anger and control. His breath hitched as the nurse leaned closer over the phone, whispering the final, horrifying detail. She woke up crying, calling for you only. That small confession shattered him. He had lived 5 years without her, telling himself it was anger, that it was necessity, that it was survival. Yet now, 5 years later, the truth clawed at him like an unseen enemy. He dropped the glass he had been holding, the shattering sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast study. The decision was instant, primal, impossible to resist. He strode from the mansion, each footstep a drumbeat of urgency, the cold night air biting at his skin but unable to touch the heat burning in his chest. His mind replayed everything, every misstep, every harsh word, every day he had lived without knowing the truth. The city streets blurred around him as he drove, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly the veins stood out like cords of steel. Every passing light, every shadow reminded him of the years he had wasted believing she had betrayed him. And yet there was hope now, fragile and terrifying, that she had never truly left him. The nurse's voice echoed again in his mind, thin and urgent. "She called for you. Only you. You need to come." He didn't question her, didn't pause to wonder if it was another trap, another cruel twist. He knew, instinctively, irrevocably, that he had to be there. By the time he reached the hospital, Alexander's pulse was a thunderclap in his ears. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of machines welcomed him, but he barely noticed. He was moving on instinct alone, a predator drawn to the scent of the only prey that had ever unsettled him in 5 years. The hallway stretched endlessly, lights flickering above him, the muffled sounds of night shift nurses and distant monitors fading into insignificance. And then he saw the door, a simple hospital room door, behind which all the mysteries and pain of 5 years waited for him. As he pushed it open, time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. And then he saw her, pale, fragile, yet defiant even in her suffering. Her eyes opened, and when they landed on him, something fractured and reformed simultaneously. The world seemed to pause as she whispered his name once more, trembling yet unmistakable, Alexander. The single word carried 5 years of grief, longing, love, and fear. Alexander felt the familiar, dangerous ache in his chest, the kind that had kept him alive and brutal, and yet now threatened to undo him entirely. The nurse hovered at the corner, uncertain whether to intervene, but Alexander didn't need her. He knew in that instant that everything, every decision, every loss, every battle, had led him to this moment, standing at the edge of the one truth he had been running from. He stepped closer, his every instinct screaming, his mind screaming, yet unable to move fast enough toward the woman who had once been his everything. Each breath he took was measured, yet ragged. A reminder that control could be stolen from him even now. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but no words came. Only another trembling whisper of his name, fragile, yet insistent. And Alexander, ruthless, unshakable, Alexander Voss, felt something he had long thought impossible. Fear. Fear that he had lost her forever. Fear that this time he might not be able to reclaim what had been stolen from him by years, distance, and pride. The world outside the hospital room ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered was the fragile figure on the bed, the whispered repetition of his name, and the knowledge that his life, in its entirety, hung on the fragile thread of her next words. His hands twitched, fingers curling and uncurling, desperate for contact, for confirmation, for proof that she was still there. Still hers, still real. The monitors hummed softly, the sound insignificant compared to the roaring inside him. And then, almost imperceptibly, she moved her hand, a tiny, trembling motion that made his pulse spike, that made the years of absence feel like nothing, and that whispered the promise of chaos, love, and reckoning all at once. Alexander's shadow fell across her bed as he knelt beside her, and for the first time in years, the armor around his heart cracked just enough for fear, longing, and hope to seep in. The nurse stepped back, sensing the unspoken tension, sensing the storm that had arrived with him. And as he leaned closer, every muscle taut, every nerve on edge, he heard her whisper again, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. Alexander. And in that single syllable, every secret, every regret, every memory of love and loss collided. It was the call that had shattered his night, the call that had shattered his life, and the call that would, inevitably, demand everything from him. Alexander's breath caught in his chest as he knelt beside her, the whisper of his name still echoing in the sterile, humming room. Her fragile hand twitched slightly, reaching out as if trying to bridge the chasm of years in a single motion. And in that instant, every memory, every unspoken word, every regret of 5 long years surged back with relentless force. She was here, alive, breathing, and yet broken in ways that mirrored the fracture in his own soul. The sight of her, pale, bruised, her chest rising unevenly as she struggled for breath, made the steel in him tremble. a rare fissure of vulnerability exposing what he had spent years burying beneath pride and power. Her eyelids fluttered as if each blink was a battle, and when her eyes finally met his, Alexander felt the impact like a punch to the heart. There it was, the undeniable connection, the spark that had refused to die despite time, distance, and all the pain they had inflicted on one another. Something in her broke at the sight of him, yet in the same moment, it seemed to mend, as though 5 years of absence had only intensified the bond that neither could sever. Her lips parted slightly, trembling, and a whisper slid out, fragile but precise. "I called you that night." The word struck him like a weapon, each syllable carrying a weight he had never imagined. That night. The memory slammed into him unrelentingly. The night of their explosive breakup, the night where anger, despair, and unbridled passion had collided into reckless desperation. He had left her that night, certain that she didn't care, certain that he had no place in her life. But now, hearing her voice, hearing the truth she had been hiding, the lie of that certainty crumbled like brittle glass under his hands. Alexander's chest tightened, each heartbeat a hammer, each inhalation a reminder of what he had believed to be lost forever. Her trembling voice reached his ears again, soft, fragile, laden with the weight of unspoken suffering. She confessed, between ragged breaths, that she had tried to call him, to explain, to reach him. But fate had intervened, stealing everything in a single brutal instant. The truth clawed at his mind, demanding acknowledgement, forcing him to confront the years of anger, isolation, and assumptions that had poisoned his heart. Every memory of her leaving, of thinking she had abandoned him, now reeled under the weight of the reality he had refused to see. His mind reeled as fragments of the past rearranged themselves, forming a picture more painful and more intimate than he had imagined possible. She tried to speak again, lips trembling, voice cracking, under the sheer effort of releasing words long trapped. Her eyes searched his, desperate for recognition, for validation, for understanding. "There's something you never knew," she whispered, each word a tremor of fear and hope intertwined. Alexander leaned closer instinctively, every nerve taut with anticipation, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. His heart thundered with both dread and desire, knowing that whatever she was about to reveal could shatter the fragile hope he dared to nurture. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in with the weight of the secret she carried, and the sterile hum of the hospital fading into insignificance. He studied her face with obsessive attention, memorizing the subtle bruises, the faint lines of pain etched across her features, the flicker of emotion in her eyes that betrayed every unspoken truth. Every breath she drew seemed synchronized with his own, a rhythm of fragile life and fragile love that neither had acknowledged in years. She reached out, fingers trembling, barely brushing against his, a touch that carried the weight of longing, guilt, and 5 years of separation. Alexander's own hands hovered uncertainly, torn between the urge to grasp, to anchor, to demand answers, and the instinct to protect, to shield her from the chaos of his own unraveling. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with each syllable. I never wanted you to think I left you, not because I didn't care. I tried so hard." The confession spilled out like a flood dammed for years, each word an admission of vulnerability that both wounded and healed him simultaneously. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the young woman he had known, fiery and defiant, with the fragile, trembling figure before him. Every lie he had believed, every misconception he had nurtured, now seemed painfully absurd. And yet, the intensity of the moment, the raw magnetism of her presence, reminded him why she had always held the power to crack even the most fortified walls he had built around his heart. Alexander leaned closer. careful not to overwhelm, careful not to frighten her, but desperate to catch every fragment of truth that escaped her lips. "Explain," he murmured, his voice rough, low, weighted with the authority of a man who had conquered everything except the ghosts of love and loss. She shivered slightly, a combination of fear and the physical toll of her injuries, but she met his gaze unwaveringly. I was going to call you," she began, her words halting but earnest. I needed to tell you, but everything. It all happened too fast. The accident, my phone, everything got lost." Her trembling hands clenched the bedsheet, nails digging in like desperate anchors as she fought to stay upright, to stay coherent, to stay in the fragile reality where he was still there. Alexander's chest tightened further as the gravity of her confession hit him with full force. He had spent 5 years believing in betrayal, abandonment, neglect. All lies he had told himself to justify his own pride and anger. Yet here she was, laying bare her soul, revealing a truth that demanded acknowledgement, demanded humility, demanded a reckoning he had long feared. He swallowed, dry throat threatening to betray him, as every instinct screamed at him to protect her, to comfort her, to take responsibility for the years of distance his own arrogance had created. The storm inside him surged, violent and intoxicating, threatening to spill over, yet held in check by the fragile hope in her eyes. Time seemed to distort, stretching each second into an eternity of shared vulnerability. She coughed softly, a delicate, painful sound, and he instinctively brushed a lock of hair from her forehead, his hand trembling slightly, betraying the intensity of his emotions. She flinched at first, then relaxed, her eyes closing briefly in trust. A trust that had never fully left him, though he had believed otherwise. The tension between them was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap with any sudden movement, any careless word. And yet, in that fragile moment, they existed only in the space between heartbeats, where every glance, every breath, every whisper carried the weight of a lifetime of regrets and longing. Her whisper reached him again, quivering yet resolute. "There's something you never knew, something I never told anyone, something that could have changed everything." The ambiguity twisted in his chest, a knife of anticipation and dread. He leaned closer, the world narrowing to the fragile, trembling figure before him. The machines around her beeped softly, a faint reminder that life continued, but it was inconsequential compared to the life-altering truth suspended between them. Alexander's eyes searched hers, every flicker of emotion a roadmap, every hesitation a warning, every tear a plea for understanding. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, gathering strength, summoning courage, and then opened them again, locking his gaze with a mixture of fear and defiance. He could see it, the vulnerability she had never let anyone witness, the strength she had cultivated in secret, the love she had harbored even through pain and absence. His pulse raced, a combination of adrenaline, longing, and raw fear, as he realized that this revelation, whatever it was, would either undo him completely or reshape the very foundation of their lives. Her lips quivered as she forced out each word, the fragility of her voice contrasting sharply with the magnitude of her confession. Alexander hung on every syllable, unable to blink, unable to breathe properly, trapped in a vortex of emotion where time and space ceased to exist. It wasn't what you thought," she whispered finally, and the weight of those simple words struck him like a thunderclap. The room seemed to tilt, the world outside fading completely, leaving only the two of them, bound by history, mistakes, love, and the precipice of revelation. And as her hand trembled in the space between them, Alexander realized that everything he had built, every wall of control, every fortress of pride was meaningless against the gravity of her presence, the truth she carried, and the love that had survived the relentless erosion of 5 years. The chapter of their lives that had been lost to anger and misunderstanding was now reopening, fragile, terrifying, and impossibly urgent. And in that room, in the hum of machines and the quiet desperation of hearts reunited, Alexander knew, with absolute clarity, that nothing would ever be the same again. 3. Alexander's mind reeled from her confession, every word a hammer striking the walls of his carefully constructed world. He felt as if the air had been violently ripped from the room, leaving only the echo of what she had just said. Pregnant, he had created life, a life that he had never known existed. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between them, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering like war drums in his chest. He could hardly move, could hardly process the enormity of the revelation, the years of anger, of assumed betrayal, of self-imposed exile from her life, came crashing down with the weight of a tidal wave. Her gaze was fragile, haunted, and yet fierce in its resolve. Emilia's hand reached weakly toward his, trembling as if to anchor him, as if she could somehow bear the burden of both their shared past and the revelation she carried. 2 weeks, she whispered, voice cracked but unwavering. I discovered it. 2 weeks after I left. I was terrified, but I wanted to tell you. Her words hung in the air, delicate and devastating. And then she froze, eyes brimming with unshed tears, a memory too painful to voice. That night, I tried to call you, to reach you, and then everything happened. Alexander's hands tightened around the rail at the side of the hospital bed, knuckles white, his muscles taut with a rage that was no longer external but turned inward. Every lie he had told himself, every assumption, every misguided conviction about her leaving, about betrayal, about abandonment, shattered into shards he could not gather fast enough. He had spent years channeling anger into control, into violence, into the empire he had built, believing he had been betrayed. And all this time, the truth had been hidden beneath the fragile, trembling body of the woman he still loved, the woman he had refused to understand. Her next words pierced deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. Alexander, I lost the baby. The phrase was barely audible, yet it tore through him with the force of a bomb. Time slowed, the monitors beeped in eerie rhythm, the sterile hospital smells seeming suddenly suffocating, oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Alexander's vision blurred. For the first time in his life, fury and grief collided with helplessness, leaving him raw, exposed, unarmed in the face of an emotional onslaught he could not dominate. He grasped the rail with both hands, leaning forward as if the physical contact could anchor him to reality. His mind refused to accept it, cycling through disbelief, denial, and rage. She had carried his child, and she had lost it, and he hadn't known. All the nights of imagining her absence, all the endless replay of their final night together, all the bitterness he had harbored against her for leaving, dissolved into a black void of shame and regret. His body trembled, not with fear of an enemy, not with anticipation of conflict, but with the raw, unfiltered grief of a man who had failed at the one thing he had never failed at before, protecting the woman he loved. Emilia's breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts, each exhalation a reminder of her fragility, each inhalation a plea for understanding, for solace, for the impossible comfort that only he could give. Her eyes, brimming with tears, fixed on him, searching for a lifeline, for reassurance, for a connection that could survive the revelation she had delivered. Alexander felt the weight of every day lost, every year of silence, every night of assumed betrayal, pressing down on him like a vice. The room tilted, the hum of fluorescent lights and distant corridors fading into insignificance compared to the storm inside him. He started, voice rough, raw, hoarse with emotion, but no words seemed adequate, no sentence capable of conveying the magnitude of his own heartbreak and guilt. He wanted to scream at her, to beg her to forgive him, to plead for a chance to undo the past, and yet he remained silent, pinned by the enormity of what she had revealed. His hands clenched the rail, veins taut, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on her trembling form. Every instinct screamed to act, to fix, to control. But there was nothing he could control, nothing to fix, only the unbearable weight of a truth that had remained hidden for half a decade. Emilia shivered under the thin hospital sheets, and he leaned closer instinctively. His presence a silent pledge. He was here. He would stay. Even if she could not speak, even if her breath came in gasps, he would remain. His chest tightened as he watched her struggle for stability, each twitch of her hand, each shiver, each tear, a testament to the strength she had shown in surviving alone. And yet she had not been able to share this, had not been able to let him into the most vulnerable part of her life. The injustice of it fueled a complex fire inside him. Grief, fury, love, helplessness, regret, a conflagration that threatened to consume every ounce of calm he had ever known. Alexander's gaze dropped to her hands, small, fragile, yet capable of enduring unimaginable pain. He wanted to take them in his, to reassure her, to promise her he would never leave again. But even that simple act seemed impossible amidst the tidal wave of truth. Every memory of their final night together, every conversation cut short, every assumption he had made, suddenly snapped into painful clarity. She had tried. She had reached. She had struggled alone. And he had been blind, arrogant, consumed by his own pride, leaving her to navigate a life-altering secret on her own. Her voice, barely a whisper, carried the tremors of fear and vulnerability. "Alexander, I didn't know how. I didn't know if I could tell you. I thought you would hate me." His heart twisted at the admission, each word a knife of remorse and longing. He wanted to reach across the distance of years, of trauma, to erase her fear, to cradle her trembling form, to tell her she had nothing to fear from him, but all he could do was stay close, breathe with her, and absorb the devastating weight of the revelation. A sudden beep from the monitors startled him, slicing through the thick, heavy silence like gunfire. The alarms were sharp, insistent, a cruel punctuation to her words. He instinctively leaned closer, eyes scanning the readouts, mind calculating, but the numbers, though alarming, paled in comparison to the devastation in front of him. The child she had carried, the proof of their shared love, was gone. The child he had unknowingly fathered had been lost in circumstances beyond their control. His fists clenched, his knuckles white, his body taut with rage that could not be directed outward, only turned inward, into the pit of grief that yawned inside him. She whimpered softly, the sound breaking his heart in ways violence never could. Alexander's hands hovered uncertainly above her trembling form, not daring to touch, not daring to move too fast, yet desperate to offer the comfort she deserved. I don't know how to make it right," he murmured, voice breaking despite himself. But the truth was, there was no making it right. There was only acknowledgement, only presence, only the fragile promise that he would not abandon her again, not after 5 years of silence and misunderstandings. Her eyes searched his, desperation mingled with fear and longing, silently pleading for an anchor, for a proof that she was not alone, that he had returned not merely in body, but in soul. Alexander's chest ached as he bent slightly, letting his shadow cover her like a shield, letting his presence speak the words he could not say. Time seemed to fracture, moments stretching and collapsing simultaneously, leaving only the unbearable, intimate space between them. The space where the past, the present, and the future collided in one single devastating revelation. The room seemed to shrink as his mind replayed the timeline, piecing together her solitary struggle, the accident, the lost calls, the hidden pregnancy, all the moments that had occurred while he had been lost in his own assumptions. He saw her in every flashback, alone, terrified, yet resolute, and his chest tightened further with both guilt and awe at her resilience. Every line of pain in her face, every tremor in her hand, every hitch of her breath now told a story of survival he had never witnessed, a story he had been blind to for far too long. And then, in a cruel twist of timing, the monitors erupted in a chorus of shrill alarms, slicing through the dense fog of grief and rage, demanding immediate attention. Alexander's pulse surged, the familiar fire of urgency igniting him even as his heart bled for her. Nurses rushed in, voices high-pitched and clipped, moving with practiced precision around him, yet he remained rooted in place, his eyes never leaving hers. He felt helpless and helplessly furious, a paradox that consumed every fiber of his being, a storm where control was impossible and yet demanded. The shrill alarms echoed through the hospital room like an invasion, snapping Alexander from the numbing paralysis that had seized him moments before. Nurses and doctors poured in, their movements precise and urgent, voices cutting through the chaos with clipped commands. Hands reached for Emilia, pulling her toward stability, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, murmuring instructions that Alexander could barely parse. Panic clawed at him. Raw and primal, the kind that had not touched him in years, not since the battlefield of his empire had become routine. Yet now, faced with the fragility of the woman who had once been his world, the panic was relentless, uncontainable. He tried to step forward, tried to intervene, but a nurse's firm hand against his chest held him back, and he realized with a jolt of helpless fury that some battles could not be won with power or intimidation. When the room finally stabilized, the frenzy subsided into a tense, taut quiet, and Alexander could see her, Emilia, truly, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Her eyes, wide and haunted, fixed on him, and he felt as though he were staring into the grief she had carried alone for half a decade. It was raw, unfiltered, and unbearable. Every line of her face told a story of nights spent in silence, of fears buried beneath determination, of hope tempered by isolation. Alexander's heart constricted as he realized that she had carried not just physical pain, but the emotional weight of secrets meant to protect him, secrets that had cost her years of her life. Her voice broke the silence, soft yet resolute, carrying the weight of years and confessions too long suppressed. "I hid it. The pregnancy," she whispered, trembling. "I carried it alone, drowning in fear and guilt. I didn't want your world, your enemies, your darkness, touching a child who never asked to be born." Each word hit him like a hammer, carving a hollow space in his chest. He had spent 5 years imagining betrayal, imagining abandonment, believing that she had left him willingly, that she had chosen another path. And all this time, the truth had been hidden. A fragile life he had never known, protected from his ruthless world by the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally. Alexander stared, silent, letting her words wash over him, each one a blade and a balm at the same time. The nurse stepped forward, offering him something that burned in his hand the moment he touched it. An old ultrasound image, fragile and worn at the edges, a relic of a life that had existed only in secrecy. He held it, feeling the weight of failure, of neglect, of years spent blaming her when he was the one who had abandoned her without asking, without listening, without fighting. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the storm inside as he traced the outline of the tiny, frozen shape on the paper. A life that should have been theirs together. Emilia's voice pierced the haze of grief and memory. "I never stopped loving you. That was the problem," she said, and the words cut deeper than any weapon he had ever faced. The honesty, the vulnerability, the sheer weight of her admission made his throat close, swallowing hard against the tide of emotion threatening to consume him. He wanted to respond, to tell her he had loved her too, that he had carried her absence like a wound, that he had regretted leaving, but the words lodged in his throat, heavy with unshed tears and guilt. The room felt impossibly small, as though the gravity of their shared history and the magnitude of her revelation had constricted the walls around them. A sudden movement by the attending doctor shattered the fragile stillness. Alexander's gaze snapped up, eyes wide with alert intensity, as the words he dreaded most fell into the room. "Her condition is unstable." The syllables reverberated in his skull, echoing against every thought, every memory, every piece of himself that had been tethered to her. Blood ran cold in his veins as adrenaline surged, a familiar storm of control and calculation igniting in the face of crisis. He wanted to act, to command, to take charge, but this was not a battlefield he could dominate with authority. This was a world of fragility, of life hanging by threads finer than steel. The doctors moved quickly, monitors beeping, the hum of machines rising to a terrifying crescendo. Alexander's eyes never left hers, watching the subtle flickers of fear, of pain, of exhaustion pass across her face. He reached for her hand instinctively, only to be stopped by a nurse, and the restraint drove a raw edge of desperation into his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to protect, to shield, to control the chaos swirling around them. But the truth remained. Some things could not be controlled. He was powerless, and the realization threatened to shatter the carefully cultivated walls of his identity. Emilia's voice, weak but defiant, broke through the cacophony. "Alexander, I wanted to tell you. I didn't want you to ever think. I left you willingly." Her trembling fingers tried to reach toward him, eyes pleading for acknowledgement, for understanding, for the reassurance that despite everything, he had returned. Alexander's chest tightened further. She'd carried secrets meant to protect him, to protect what they could have had, to protect the child she bore in silence. And now, that effort, that love, that sacrifice confronted him with the full weight of all he had lost and all he had taken for granted. He felt the urge to collapse beside her, to gather her into his arms, to shield her from the world that had always threatened to harm her. Yet the presence of the doctors, the urgency of the alarms, the fragile beeping of machines tethering her life to the room restrained him. He clenched his fists at his sides, jaw tight, vision blurred with unshed tears and fury. The rage that had always been his weapon, the weapon that had built empires and broken enemies, turned inward, a dangerous fire fueled by helplessness. He had never felt this powerless before, and the sensation terrified him. The nurse handed him another piece of paper, trembling slightly. Notes, medical charts, details he had never learned to navigate. Alexander barely registered the content. His focus was entirely on her, on the fragile, trembling body that had survived so much alone. His chest ached as he realized that she had endured this pain without him, without his presence, while he had been consumed by his own pride and assumptions. Every thought he had entertained for 5 years, every grudge he had held against her, now appeared as folly, as arrogance, as a failure of heart and mind. Emilia's whisper cut through the haze again. "I loved you, Alexander. I never stopped. That was my mistake, my curse, and my truth." The simplicity of her words belied their immense power, their ability to fracture and rebuild simultaneously. Alexander swallowed hard, each breath trembling as he tried to absorb the enormity of what she had endured, of what he had missed, of what he had lost. He wanted to respond, to pour every ounce of love, regret, an apology into a confession of his own, yet the words faltered under the weight of reality. The doctor stepped closer, his expression sharp, authoritative, commanding attention. "We need to act fast," he said, voice clipped, urgent. "Her vitals are deteriorating. This is critical." Alexander's hands trembled despite himself, caught between the need to assert control and the helplessness that gripped him. Every instinct screamed at him to take charge, to command, to fix. Yet this was a battle beyond power. A battle where the only weapon was presence, vigilance, and the fragile hope that she would survive. Time slowed, each second stretching endlessly as he watched the flurry of medical staff, their movements precise yet blurred, as if the world around him had lost coherence. His focus remained on her pale, fragile face, on the tremor in her lips, on the slight hitch in her breath. He wanted to memorize every detail, every expression, every nuance of pain and courage, because he knew, deep down, that these moments could be fleeting, fragile, and impossible to reclaim. He leaned closer, voice low, almost a growl against the soft mechanical hum of life-saving equipment. "I am here," he whispered, letting the weight of his presence, his promise, and his love fill the space between them. "I am not leaving again, not ever." Emilia's eyelids fluttered at the sound of his voice, recognition and relief warring with exhaustion and fear. Her lips parted slightly, a fragile attempt at speech, and he leaned closer, ready to catch every word, ready to anchor her in the chaos that surrounded them. And as the monitors beeped in sharp, insistent tones, Alexander realized with chilling clarity that the past 5 years had been a lie of his own making. He had assumed betrayal, assumed abandonment, assumed indifference, all assumptions built on pride, all assumptions shattered in an instant by the fragile truth she carried alone, the ultrasound image, the whispered confession, the fragile presence of life that had been hidden, and the imminent threat to her survival, merged into a vortex of emotion that left him raw, unguarded, and entirely human for the first time in his adult life. Alexander remained frozen for a long moment as the medical staff gradually retreated, leaving the room eerily quiet, except for the faint beeping of monitors. His chest heaved, and his hands, clenched tightly at his sides, slowly released their tension, but the storm inside him raged on. For the first time in years, he had no control, no authority, no dominance, only the unbearable weight of witnessing the woman he loved, the woman who had carried his child in secret, in fragile, trembling breaths. Every rise and fall of her chest was a reminder of everything he had lost, every assumption he had made, every night he had spent imagining betrayal when there had been none. He moved closer, careful not to startle her, but instinctively, as if drawn by some magnetic force he had never acknowledged, he reached out and took her hand, just to feel the warmth of her presence, the fragile pulse of life she had carried alone. Her fingers twitched, barely reciprocating the gesture, but the contact was enough. He didn't speak. Words felt meaningless against the tidal wave of emotion pressing against his chest. Every memory of the past, every regret, every moment he had wasted, steeped him in a suffocating realization. She had suffered alone, silently, while he had assumed betrayal and abandoned hope. Hours passed in a strange, suspended time. Alexander didn't sleep. He didn't move. He simply sat beside her, observing every subtle detail, memorizing each nuance of her fragile existence, every flicker of her eyelids, every tremor in her hands, every uneven breath. Her survival, her resilience, her quiet courage tore at him more profoundly than any battle, any gunfight, any empire he had built. For the first time, he understood that the greatest victories were not over enemies, but over the pain of love lost, over the cost of pride, over the consequences of silence. When Emilia finally opened her eyes, they were wide, filled with a fragile mix of confusion, recognition, and disbelief. She blinked rapidly, as though the act of seeing him again could overwhelm her senses. Alexander leaned closer, studying her every reaction, every subtle movement, every tremor in her gaze. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, to confess, but words remained trapped in his throat, swallowed by the enormity of their shared history. Her gaze searched his face, as though trying to reconcile the man before her with the memory of the man she had once loved and feared she had lost forever. Why did you come?" she whispered, voice weak, almost hesitant, trembling as if every syllable demanded courage. The question struck him in the chest, each word a knife of longing and regret. He swallowed, the weight of years pressing down on his heart, and answered simply, painfully, "Because you called my name." The honesty, stripped of pretense, cut through the dense fog of years of silence, of anger, of misconception, leaving only truth and raw emotion. Emilia's lips parted slightly, a gasp, a shiver, a recognition of the vulnerability he was allowing her to witness. Her gaze softened, shifting between disbelief and tentative hope. She began to speak, each word fragile yet precise, carrying the burden of half a decade of loneliness, of longing, of suppressed emotions. I spent years waiting, hoping, hating, loving, all at the same time, she confessed, her voice quivering under the weight of her honesty. I buried hope just to survive. I hated you for leaving, for abandoning me. Yet I loved you still, and I don't know how to stop. Alexander's chest tightened. Each word was a blow, a revelation, a reminder of the immense emotional chasm that had grown between them, and yet, paradoxically, a bridge built on the undeniable strength of lingering love. He reached for her hand again, fingers brushing hers in a tentative grasp, and this time she did not flinch. The contact, though slight, carried an intensity that transcended words. Alexander spoke softly, deliberately, letting every syllable bear the weight of his truth. I never got over you, he said, voice low, rough with suppressed emotion. I never replaced you. I never stopped replaying our last night in my head, every word, every touch, every argument. His gaze locked on hers, piercing and vulnerable simultaneously. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I'm not leaving again. Not now. Not ever. Her breath hitched at his words, her eyes wide, shimmering with tears that had fought to remain contained for decades of fear and doubt. She reached for his hand, trembling slightly, as though to test whether his presence was real, whether his promise held substance, whether he had truly returned to stay. The vulnerability in her movement, the raw fragility of the moment, held him captive. Alexander tightened his grip just enough to reassure her, but not enough to overpower, respecting the delicacy of trust being rebuilt in increments measured by courage and survival. Her voice was almost inaudible, fragile, trembling with the weight of fear, hope, and exhaustion. Don't stay, unless you mean it, because I'm not strong enough to lose you twice. The confession shattered him in ways he hadn't anticipated, piercing deeper than any blade, more profound than any gunshot, more insidious than any betrayal he had endured in his violent life. His chest constricted. heart hammering, and he realized the magnitude of the promise he had just been entrusted to uphold, the chance to love without retreat, to be present without evasion, to restore what had been broken without hesitation. Alexander's gaze softened, yet held an intensity that spoke volumes, the kind of gaze that carried both accountability and devotion. "I mean it," he said, voice steady despite the tumult of emotion roiling within him. "I will stay. I will not leave again. You are the only life I care to protect, the only truth I cannot forsake." The words, though simple, carried the weight of a man stripped of pride, of power, of control. A man finally willing to confront vulnerability, to shoulder the consequences of past mistakes, and to embrace the fragile possibility of a future built on honesty and trust. Time seemed suspended as they sat there, hands entwined, breaths synchronized, the sterile hospital room fading into insignificance compared to the emotional gravity of their reunion. Alexander observed every flicker of expression on her face, every subtle tremor, every heartbeat, memorizing them, safeguarding them in the vault of his mind. He understood with a clarity that came only from devastation and longing that the cost of pride and silence had been years of lost moments, and that the effort to rebuild trust would require patience, presence, and unwavering fidelity. Emilia's eyelids fluttered, the fatigue of physical and emotional strain evident, yet her gaze remained locked on him, searching for the assurance that his presence promised. Alexander leaned slightly closer, careful not to overwhelm, letting the warmth of his body and the steadiness of his hand speak the truth that words could never fully convey. He was here. He had returned. He would remain, and he would not falter. The room was still, the world outside irrelevant, as their shared history, regrets, and enduring love collided into a fragile equilibrium, tense and trembling, yet unbreakable in its essence. Even in the midst of quiet, there was a tension, a taut wire strung between confession and trust, fear and hope, grief and longing. Every heartbeat, every blink, every subtle shift carried the weight of possibility and fragility. Alexander knew that each moment was a test, each breath a measure of faith, each whisper a chance to rebuild a bridge burned by pride and misunderstanding. He remained steadfast, present, and unyielding, allowing the gravity of their shared past to inform but not imprison the possibilities of their future. The minutes stretched into hours, each one an eternity filled with silent acknowledgement, subtle gestures, and unspoken confessions. Alexander's gaze never left hers, observing, memorizing, guarding, understanding. He had spent a lifetime mastering control over chaos, over power, over enemies, and yet he had never encountered a battle more delicate, more profound, than the slow, fragile reclamation of a love nearly lost. And in the quiet tension of the hospital room, he realized the truth he had never fully admitted. Some wars are won, not with violence, but with presence, honesty, and the unwavering courage to remain. Alexander remained kneeling beside her hospital bed, his hands gently holding hers, feeling the subtle tremor of her fragile fingers. The room was quiet, except for the faint, rhythmic beeping of the monitors, but the silence carried the weight of a lifetime. 5 years of lost love, of pride, of regret. He was no longer the untouchable force that had ruled his empire with absolute control. In this room, at this moment, vulnerability replaced power, and it terrified him more than any rival ever could. Yet he stayed. Emilia's eyes, still glassy from tears, studied him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, to test the truth of his promise, to confirm that he had returned for good and not as a fleeting shadow of memory. "Alexander, you mean it?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity carried through the room like a thunderclap. He squeezed her hands gently, his gaze unwavering, the corners of his jaw tense with both emotion and determination. "I mean it," he said, voice low, firm, almost a growl, carrying the weight of every truth he had withheld, every regret, every longing he had carried silently for years. For the first time, he allowed her questions, her probing, her testing of his sincerity. She asked about the nights he had spent away, about the empire he had built, about the violence and the decisions that had shaped his life. She challenged him, demanded the truth, forced him to confront pieces of himself he had long hidden behind walls of control, pride, and ruthlessness. Alexander answered honestly, even when the words hurt, even when the truths of his past exposed vulnerabilities he had never allowed anyone to see. And he didn't retreat. He didn't run. He stayed. "I never stopped thinking about that night," he admitted, voice rough and raw. "Not because it was the end, but because it should have been our beginning." The confession hung between them, fragile, yet impossible to ignore. Emilia's hand tightened slightly around his, and her lips quivered with unspoken emotion. She had waited, hoped, feared, and now here he was, breaking through every doubt she had carried for years. The tension was palpable, a taut wire strung between them, threatening to snap but holding them together with the fragility of trust reborn. Her tears flowed freely now, as though the dam she had held for years had finally given way. I still love you, Alexander," she confessed, her voice trembling, raw, and unguarded. "Despite everything, despite the pain, despite the years apart, I never stopped." Alexander's chest tightened, and he leaned closer instinctively, pulling her gently against him, feeling the warmth of her body, the fragility of her presence, and the undeniable force of their bond. He held her as though she were the last good thing in the world, as though losing her again was unimaginable. Their reunion was not gentle. It was jagged, raw, a collision of 5 years of pain, longing, fear, and love. There were moments of silence filled with heavy breaths and unspoken confessions. There were moments when she pulled back slightly, testing his resolve, testing whether he would stay, testing whether the love they had endured could survive the scars of time and absence. Alexander did not flinch. He did not retreat. He matched her, step for step, word for word, heartbeat for heartbeat. He whispered apologies for the years of assumption, the nights spent believing betrayal instead of understanding, the silence that had separated them. She listened, tears falling freely now, and offered forgiveness in slow, deliberate breaths, in the gentle touch of her hand, in the subtle tilt of her head toward him. Every micro-gesture, every unspoken moment rebuilt trust not with grand declarations, but with presence, with patience, with the fragile courage of 2 hearts unwilling to let go again. Alexander vowed silently with every fiber of his being to rebuild every broken piece of her life if he had to. He would repair what had been damaged, protect what had been fragile, cherish what had been hidden, his empire, his power, his violence. None of it mattered now. All that mattered was her survival, her trust, her love, and she allowed herself finally to lean against him, to rest her head on his chest, to let the barrier of years crumble under the weight of truth and presence. But even in this fragile cocoon of intimacy, a tension lingered. Alexander could feel it, the subtle pause in her breathing, the slight tremor in her fingers, the unspoken truth that hovered between them like a ghost. Emilia's lips barely moved as she whispered, her voice low and trembling. "There's something else I need to tell you, but I'm scared you'll walk away again." The words sliced through the fragile calm, a thread of tension that threatened to unravel everything they had rebuilt. Alexander stiffened, heart hammering, every instinct screaming to brace himself for more pain, more revelation, more test of their bond. He tilted his head slightly, leaning closer, voice steady but filled with undeniable urgency. "Whatever it is, I am not leaving," he said, voice low, resonant with a promise forged from years of regret and longing. "Nothing you tell me can make me walk away. I am here. I stay. Always." Emilia's gaze locked with his, searching, questioning, seeking proof, seeking courage. The vulnerability in her eyes mirrored the vulnerability in him, and for the first time, the walls between them were gone, stripped bare by shared grief, shared love, shared survival. Minutes passed in silence, each second stretching with the weight of anticipation. The room seemed to contract, focusing solely on the space between them, the heat of their shared presence, the delicate balance of truth and fear, every subtle shift in her posture. Every catch of her breath, every fluttering eyelash carried significance. Alexander observed all, noting the tension in her shoulders, the tremor in her fingers, the pulse of life and love that had persisted despite years of absence and assumed betrayal. He allowed her to speak at her own pace, letting the words come slowly, letting the weight of revelation unfold naturally, understanding that trust, once fractured, could not be forced or rushed. Each confession, each tear, each whispered truth was a thread in the reconstruction of what had been broken, and Alexander held her through it, steady, unwavering, a living anchor in the storm of emotions. Even as she began to speak, hesitating, pausing, retreating into fear, he did not flinch. His hand tightened around hers in reassurance, his presence a fortress of unyielding commitment. "You cannot lose me, Emilia," he murmured, voice low, firm yet gentle. "Not now, not ever again. Whatever you need to tell me, I will listen. Whatever you have feared, I will face with you. Always." Her head tilted slightly, breath hitching, and a fragile tear slipped down her cheek. The room felt suspended in a delicate equilibrium, fragile yet indestructible, as if the years of separation, the pain, the fear, the lost opportunities, all coalesced into a single, defining moment. Alexander felt the gravity of it, the impossibility, the raw intensity, the profound love that had endured despite every obstacle, every misunderstanding, every moment apart. Even as she whispered her fears, hesitated, and tested the limits of his promise, Alexander remained steadfast. He leaned slightly closer, letting the warmth of his presence speak louder than any words could, letting the solidity of his commitment, forged through pain and reflection, reassure her that he would never walk away again. The tension in the air, the fragile line between vulnerability and fear, was palpable, yet the underlying truth was unshakable. He had chosen love over pride, honesty over power, her over everything else. Alexander's hands remained steady on Emilia's, holding her fragile fingers as she whispered her fears. The words tumbled out slowly, haltingly, each one a shard of vulnerability she had held back for years. "Alexander, it's not just from the accident," she said, voice trembling but deliberate, her eyes locking on his as though daring him to run. "The doctors. They suspect I might never carry a child again." Each syllable struck him like a hammer to his chest. The room, the world, the life he had fought so hard to control seemed to tilt, unbalanced and fragile. For a fraction of a second, he felt the old instinctive fear, the one that had kept him distant, armored, invincible. But it didn't take root. He didn't flinch. He didn't break. He didn't retreat. His hands cupped her face gently, thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and he looked into her eyes with a certainty she had never expected, with a fire she had only glimpsed in fleeting moments of his past. "I didn't lose you 5 years ago," he said, his voice low, resonant, unwavering, "but I'm damn sure not losing you now." The intensity of his gaze, the certainty in his words, anchored her trembling heart, drawing her out of fear and into the warmth of a promise made with his very soul. Tears welled in Emilia's eyes, but this time they were not just of fear. They were a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the past could be rewritten. Alexander held her tighter, pressing his forehead to hers for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of her hair, the faint tremor in her breath. It was grounding. It was intimate. It was a silent acknowledgement that survival was not just physical, but emotional, and that love, once proven, could endure anything. When the hospital finally discharged her, Alexander made a choice that shocked even him. He didn't take her back to the fortress of steel, shadows, and guns that had been his life, the life that had driven her away once. Instead, he carried her gently to the small apartment she had once dreamed of escaping to. A space that had never been hers fully but now became a sanctuary of rebirth. The streets outside were quiet, the sun beginning to hint at dawn, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt a calm he hadn't allowed himself to know. Inside the apartment, he set her down carefully on the sofa, letting her stretch out, letting her breathe without fear, without urgency, without danger pressing from every angle. The walls were bare, but filled with possibility, the air clean and warm. He didn't ask for forever. He didn't make grand declarations. He simply sat beside her, close enough to offer presence, yet distant enough to let her process. Every small breath they shared, every brush of a hand against the other, was a reaffirmation of trust, rebuilt, of patience earned, of love reclaimed. Sunlight crept through the half-drawn curtains, washing over them like a benediction. Alexander watched her face, noting every subtle expression, the tilt of her lips, the slight furrow of her brow, the shimmer of hope in her eyes. He realized that love did not need grandiose gestures to survive. It needed presence, attention, and the courage to remain when all else could tempt one to flee. Emilia, sensing his unwavering focus, reached for his hand, fragile yet determined, intertwining her fingers with his. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a universe of meaning. Trust, dependence, hope, and the quiet power of shared survival. "Maybe," she whispered, voice soft yet resonant with the weight of everything they had endured. "Maybe we were never meant to end. Maybe we just needed to break first." The words were a balm, a truth neither had dared to articulate for years. Alexander's gaze softened, lingering on her like she was a rebirth, a second chance carved out of pain and regret, forged in the fire of time and absence. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, letting his thumb trace the delicate line of her jaw. "Then we rebuild," he said, voice low but unwavering. "Piece by piece, together. We rebuild everything, because we're here now." For a long moment, silence enveloped them, comfortable yet charged. The world outside remained distant, inconsequential compared to the fragile, sacred bubble they inhabited. Alexander's thumb continued to trace hers, heart pounding with a quiet urgency he hadn't felt since the first night they had fallen apart. Emilia leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder, and he allowed himself to feel, fully, without restraint, the profound relief and exhilaration of having her presence, of having the possibility of a life remade together. And then, just as he was about to close the distance between them fully, to let words and touches merge into something wholly intimate and healing, the sharp chime of her phone rang through the quiet apartment. Both of them startled slightly. The sound, ordinary yet urgent, carried an edge of tension, and Emilia's hand shot to retrieve it. Alexander, sensing the hold of potential danger or revelation, leaned closer instinctively, eyes narrowed, alert. Her fingers trembled as she swiped to answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was clinical, detached, yet loaded with significance. the doctor calling back with results that could alter everything. Alexander held his breath, feeling the fragile tension coil in his chest. Emilia's eyes widened slightly and she turned toward him, her expression caught between fear and hope, uncertainty and trust. He tightened his hold on her hand, grounding both of them, ready to face whatever truth was about to emerge. The phone call stretched on, brief but heavy with implications. Every second seemed to stretch endlessly. Alexander's gaze never left hers, studying every subtle flicker of emotion, every slight quiver of her lips, every glimmer of determination masked by trepidation. When she finally ended the call, she looked at him with eyes brimming with tears. Not just fear, but relief, and a tentative hope that the future they had fought for, endured for, and longed for might finally be within reach. She exhaled slowly, leaning fully against his chest, and Alexander's arms wrapped around her as if to shield her from every danger, every lingering shadow, every memory that might try to disrupt their fragile peace. It's manageable," she whispered, voice quivering but steady. "The doctors, they'll help. We can still—" The words trailed, but the meaning was clear. Survival, love, and the possibility of family still existed. Alexander held her tighter, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, letting the warmth of his presence and the gravity of his commitment settle between them. "We face it together," he said softly, almost a vow, almost a prayer. "No running, no hiding, no leaving. Together, Emilia. We face everything, and nothing will break us again." The weight of the words, the sincerity, the promise, filled the apartment like sunlight spilling over the walls, illuminating the fractures and the hope alike. The sunrise crept higher, bathing them in gold, and for the first time in years, Alexander allowed himself to feel an ease he had never permitted. A love reclaimed, a bond reforged, a life renewed. Emilia's head remained on his shoulder, her fingers entwined with his, and in that simple act of presence, Alexander realized that this moment, fragile, imperfect, yet wholly theirs, was enough. All the past, all the pain, all the fear had led to this rebirth of love, of hope, and of life itself. And as the soft morning light wrapped around them, Alexander pressed his lips to her temple, whispering words meant only for her. "We are here, we survived, and we will not let go, not now, not ever." Emilia lifted her gaze to meet his, a fragile smile breaking through, and for the first time in years, they breathed together, in sync, whole, and unafraid of the world outside. The phone lay silent beside them now. The threat of uncertainty managed, the promise of tomorrow solidified, and Alexander understood with quiet certainty that their second chance, hard-won, scarred, but real, was the life they had both been waiting for, the beginning they had once lost, now finally within reach. And in that moment, the past 5 years of pain, of longing, and of separation dissolved into nothing but memory, leaving only love, presence, and the fragile, unbreakable bond of two hearts finally reunited.